Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online Ministers Forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community, and all who wish to join us online, science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get us through these difficult times. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Filipe Maia. We'll be talking about how a theological understanding of hope can enable responses to these times. Dr. Maia is an assistant professor of theology at Boston University. His research there focuses on liberation theologies and philosophies, theology and economics, and eschatology, or the ultimate destiny of humanity. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe that we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these conversations a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Filipe, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me here, and greetings to all of you at First Church in Houston, and thank you, Colin, for having me here.
Very excited to have you for this conversation, and I thought we'd start out by talking about the protests that we're in the midst of. So as you know, and as our viewers know, we're in the midst of the largest wave of protests around the globe for racial justice since the 1960s. Many people are hoping that these protests will bring about lasting change. And in the United States, protesters have won everything from promises from politicians to defund or even downright abolish the police. You think and write a lot about how our imagination of the future impacts how we live today, especially as it relates to the language of hope. So I thought we could begin with a discussion of the language of hope, how it pertains to the protests and how it relates to those who oppose them. Are there different kinds of hope?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, thank you. I would begin answering it or offering a possible answer to it by suggesting that hope is, for me, as I think of it, is not just a matter of personal attitude. It's not just a matter of, for me, the cup is always half full. I'm a hopeful person as opposed to someone who is a pessimist to whom the cup is always half empty. I treat hope as something that is sort of socially constructed, socially generated, and also socially binding, that we sort of think of hope and engender hope and construct hope as communities, and we do that socially and together. Hope is built, I think, and it's engendered in us by social forces, communal energies that really shape who we are, what we aspire to be or to become, and what we deem ultimately worthy of our hope, worthy of our expectations and aspirations. So I've been thinking about the work of a womanist scholar, Carrie Day, who writes about hope as something that is like a social practice. It's something that we construct together socially, like a practice. It's like you're practicing something together, and the results of that are sort of common to us all. So that's how I've been thinking about hope in that way. So in that sense, of course, then the protests, everything that is happening, in terms of the riots against police brutality and anti-black racism in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, all of that to me is a site of hope. Folks are assembling on the street in a time, in a present that is kind of too stifling, too impossible to live on. And so those movements are generating hope insofar they're saying that it's insufficient. We need something more. We need something different. So those gatherings on the streets, those protest movements are they're constructing a different possibility for our future. And therefore, to me, they're extremely hopeful. They're filled with hope. Now, of course, on the other hand, insofar as hope is kind of socially constructed, and these movements are also threatening those to whom the present is kind of sufficient, comfortable. And so I do think there are competing modes of hope, ways of imagining the future of our society that are right now at stake. So the backlash against those protest movements, in many ways, is a fight over different aspirations for what the future can be. And I'm not surprised that the backlash, the critique to those movements involve certain language about the future, precisely because it comes from social groups to whom the present is comfortable, and there's privilege involved in the present. So any form of movement that questions the authority of the present, the hegemony of the present, if you will, are threats. And I do think these riots, these protest movements, they do challenge the status quo, and therefore those who hope for the continuance of things as they are will oppose those movements.
So, I mean, I really love this idea that hope is now, in the way you're talking about, the way you're understanding it, is moved from something that's a thought or maybe an emotion to actually something that's a practice and an action.
Correct.
So it's not like to say that I have hope for the future, just to use that simple construction, moves from something to say like I have an idea or a thought or a desire for a future, but is actually I'm engaging in a practice in an effort to bring about some kind of future.
Correct. Yes, that's absolutely the case. Yeah. Of course, that I think engagement with reality creates emotions, effects on us that may render us certain dispositions in us on our emotional lives and etc. But I think that's not all that there is to be said about hope. So I'm trying to think of hope as that which is being generated in those movements that are engaged in the transformation of reality. Yes.
I feel like we could kind of keep going on this subject for a while, but I know there's another kind of hope that you've been thinking a lot about, which is actually very related to these protests in some way, which is the relationship between hope and future talk and capitalism, and how capitalism is an economic system that has some kind of hope embedded in it, but hope is also something that can be used to oppose it. And certainly, I mean, I think that we'd probably both agree that the protests are taking place within a context of racialized capitalism, and that, there is that deep connection between race and capitalism that needs to be, well, I guess untangled if you're some kind of liberal reformist, or abolished if you have a more radical view. If we're going to see this moment of protest lead to something substantive. So could you help us understand the relationship between hope, future talk, and capitalism? And I guess maybe the easiest way to just start that is capitalism an economic system based upon hope?
I believe so. I do think that there is a certain kind of future binding attitude in capitalism. There's a sociologist, Anthony Giddens, described capitalism as a system who is constantly trying to break away from its past, and here's his expression, it's not mine, and colonize the future. So this image of colonizing the future is intriguing to me. I don't think Giddens, this author, has sort of fully unpacked the implications of thinking of capitalism as a system that tries to colonize the future. But I do think the analogy is adequate and not accidental. So if you think of colonialism as a movement of expansion that keeps trying to expand itself into new areas, new markets, new lands, for the sake of profit, it's interesting then to think of capitalism as having this sort of future-bound trajectory to it, because everything is potentially profitable, including the future. And so in my work, I've been meditating on the fact that futures is the name of a commodity, right? That one can buy and sell and trade in financial markets. So futures is the name of a kind of a contract that you can agree upon and buy and trade in open markets. And I think that the naming of that commodity is kind of symbolic of the nature of capitalism. That is as a system that commodified everything, including the future, including everything that is not yet, that is something that is to come. And capitalism, therefore, sort of thinks of that as somehow profitable and tries to objectify it, anticipate it for the sake of profit. So that's how I've been thinking about capitalism is this kind of system that relies upon a particular projection of what the future is, what the future will be, and tries to sort of anticipate what the future will be for its own sake. Now, of course, that has detrimental effects. So in the same way that different language about hope and the future can be used to justify atrocities, injustices in the present, I do think that there is this kind of ongoing justification to capitalism itself that is based on this idea that the system will eventually work out. It will eventually, reach equilibrium, that there is this kind of invisible hand, if you will, that will lead us into prosperity, even though the president shows that, no, this is not where we're heading, that we are living in an oligarchy that with massive income distribution and economic injustice and economic oppression. So the language of the future here sort of functions to justify and to gloss over that present reality. So in that sense, I also think that there is that element of discourse about capitalism that uses the future or language of the future to justify everything that is not working in the present.
Well, and I mean, I think you didn't lift up a word that I think is very close to this kind of discourse, which is progress.
Correct.
Right? Which I think is really related to this. And the idea that we can sort of make progress moving forward within the current system. Right? I mean, that's what differentiates progressives, at least historically, between those of us who have sort of more radical socialist or anarchist perspectives, right, where one suggests that we can progressively refine the system, whereas the other suggests, well, you have to change it. I mean, I think about the argument right now between police reform and police abolition, right? Like, there's lots of people who are, like the current presidential candidate for the Democratic Party is talking a lot about police reform and how we need to, like, deal with bad actors and, reform systems that already exist. Whereas there are downright police abolitionists who are suggesting instead that we need to just abolish police departments. And it's, I mean, for those of you who listened to my sermon on Sunday or heard, and if you haven't, you might want to. I mean, I actually talk about how abolition of policing is something that's even happened before. So it gets pointed out as like this completely pie in the sky idea, but it is something that people have accomplished in Northern Ireland and in Camden, New Jersey. Now, so the question is, are we hoping for a replacement of the system? Are we hoping for reforming or progressively improving the system? And I think that the way you're encouraging us to think about capitalism really lifts up that question.
Yep.
And I think uncovers the disjunction between capitalism and perhaps hope for a more just society, because as you pointed out, capitalism is a system that has been, built on a lot of brutal exploitation of the planet and of people. I mean, there's a direct link between capitalist wealth in this country and in and the legacy of of slavery. So I don't know if you have anything you want to say in response
Yeah,
to that.
no, that's excellent. Thank you for that comment. I would concur with everything that you have said, and especially the initial comment about sort of capitalism being sort of enmeshed in a certain idea of progress. I think that's, you know, the link is there historically between, the Scottish Enlightenment and folks like Adam Smith, who had a very clear understanding of what historical progress is. A question that I would add to your comments, or a comment, would be that perhaps we progressives need to think of progress differently.
Oh,
Not
interesting.
in terms of linear progress, but a progress that includes ruptures and interruptions. I think that is one of the flaws in this kind of Enlightenment theory of progress, that it sort of assumes that progress happens somehow linearly, right? It's a timeline. We're just moving towards it, almost by law. It's a historical fact that we are moving in a particular direction, that history progresses linearly towards the future. I think the kind of vision of the future, or hope, that I am trying to articulate is one that entails ruptures. First of all, one that recognizes that there is a kind of hope that emerges out of the tragedy of history, out of just radical injustice, and misery and melancholia and oppression. And that form of future talk that emerges in that context bears witness to that melancholy, to that anger, to that oppression. And so its vision of progress, its progressive nature, is not linear, but it requires those ruptures, those historical ruptures, including, perhaps, why not, the abolition of police forces. So I think if I were to think of the abolition of the discussions around the abolition of police in those terms, I would think of progress as part of, or in need of, that rupture in the current way that we think of police force.
So a sort of kairos moment, to sort of invoke Paul Tillich, the idea that
Correct.
there's right, yeah, a
Yeah,
moment.
I know you've preached on that too, right?
Yes, I preached on that too. Well, you and I have known each other now for like 7 or 8 years, so I think that we've had a lot of conversations along these lines at various points.
Yeah.
So actually, I want to turn more explicitly to the subject of race, especially now, within the context of the resurgence of Black Lives Matter as a movement. It's an important subject, but I think you have a particular perspective on it that would be very helpful for people to hear about, because you're not from the United States, you're from Brazil, which is a country with a history of slavery that is not dissimilar to that of the United States. And Brazil is now only second to the United States in cases of and deaths from the novel coronavirus. And like the United States, it also is run by a white-wing populist. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could help us see some connections between all these parallels, or maybe I shouldn't say, can you help us see, do you see some connections between all these parallels?
The connections are all over the place, and you named them already. Beginning and fundamentally, the legacy of slavery. So, like the United States, Brazil it's enmeshed in that history and the legacy of slavery. In fact, our legacy is longer than the one in the United States. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. It only did so in 1888, so towards the very end of the 19th century. There were some laws in the 1860s that sort of allowed for the legal recognition of a child born of a slave mother to be recognized as a free person. But of course, in the social and historical context, that meant that person was that infant was fundamentally a slave, even though legally recognized as a free person. So the legacy is immense historically. One other difference, perhaps, between Brazil and the United States is just the sheer volume of slaves that were captured in Africa and taken into into slavery in Brazil. The figures are difficult to gauge, but it's about a third of all individuals captured in Africa were taken and ended up in Brazil. So today the country has roughly 50 to 55% of our population has some form of African roots, and that's about 115, 120 million people.
Wow.
Who identify either as black or as of mixed race.
Mm-hmm.
And like the United States, there is a long and perverse history of police and state-sponsored brutality against black bodies in Brazil. This is not news for us, but there is, I guess, a certain level of international solidarity that is now building up after Black Lives Matter emerged in the United
Mm-hmm.
States. So there is a growing kind of energy in Brazil right now around this slogan and this commitment. It's still, like in the United States, the legacy of white supremacy is profound. So it's still early, I think, to discern whether or the lasting effects of these movements.
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly paying close attention to it, and I think there's a lot to hope for in those movements. With regards to our two presidents, they are also very similar. Bolsonaro was elected a couple of years ago on a flagrantly fascist platform. He was not trying to disguise it. And his version of fascism is profoundly racist. Also, he was not subtle about it, and is not subtle about it. Not only there's a racism that is anti-black, but also in Brazil, right now, there's a profound injustice on the part of the federal government against indigenous populations. The viewers might have heard about the fires in the Amazon last year. This continues this season, this year. It's not making national or international news because of the pandemic, and the government is actually openly using the fact that there is this pandemic as a smokescreen to continue to loosen environmental laws to protect the Amazon forest and its native populations. So Bolsonaro is right there at the crux of this white supremacist agenda, and that's how it's his political platform, really.
Okay, this is like one of those comments where I might be actually ignorant, but I feel like Bolsonaro has connections to evangelical Christianity. Is that true?
It is, and it's one of the bizarre things about his presidency. He is himself Roman Catholic,
Okay.
but he has massive support from Brazilian evangelicals. And the reason why I say this is kind of bizarre is that Brazilian Protestantism, which is my tradition, I grew up Methodist in Brazil, is profoundly anti-Catholic. So for those of you in the U.S. who know a little bit of the history, think of 19th century American Protestantism and the missionary movement. You probably know that those missionaries had a vision to evangelize the world and had a vision of manifest destiny. And they were very suspicious of Roman Catholic Christianity, right? So that's still that is true for Brazilian Methodism, Brazilian Protestantism, and evangelical traditions in the country. But over the past couple of decades, I would say there's been a shift, I think, in the kind of religious scene in the country, and Bolsonaro was able to capture that kind of religious fervor, that conservative religious fervor, to his benefit. So he did some kind of symbolic gestures that really appealed to evangelicals in the country, and he today is like by far his most solid and loyal political base.
So I have to ask the question because it's just sitting there right for me, or right for us, is, okay, so the current president of the United States, who is, I mean, I've gone on record in many forums as calling a white supremacist populist. with quite extensive historical footnoting to that and what that means.
Yeah.
And the president of Brazil, it sounds like from the way you're describing him and from what I've read, could be described as a white supremacist populist too. Now, they're both supported by evangelical Christianity. And of course, we mean evangelical Christianity not being an evangelist in the sense of spreading the good news, but the sort of particular form of evangelical Christianity that's now widespread throughout the globe, which is very oriented towards individual salvation, oriented towards, future life rather than future life on earth, but future life in another realm, in another metaphysical realm. And in most cases, sovereignty of a particular conception of God over the earth, humanity, and the universe. So I'm just wondering if you have any reflections for us on why it is, or what is the relationship between this particular kind of evangelicalism and these, white supremacist populists. Because in the United States, you can make the argument, and many people have, that white evangelical Christianity is a sort of cultural form of a confederacy that has existed in retreat over the last 150 years, right? I mean, that's, 4 cases of books in a library, in Harvard's library or someplace like that will make that argument. Is a similar phenomenon at work in Brazil? And really, what are those of us who are religious scholars, religious leaders, to make of this enduring connection, or this at least significant connection right now between evangelical Christianity, as it is sort of commonly practiced, and I'm not saying all evangelical Christians, so anyone who hears this, don't hear me saying that, but certainly the majority of them in the United States, and it sounds like in Brazil, support these reactionary movements and these reactionary political leaders. Do you have any idea of what's going on with that might be illuminating for us?
That's a difficult question. I do have a few ideas. I think in the case of Brazil, I would take a step back historically and just say that there is a legacy of just conservative thinking that predates sort of the explosion of evangelical movements in the 1980s in the country. So that kind of conservative, moralistic ethos is present in Brazilian culture. And these movements that are emerging more recently, let's call them evangelical for now. There are some difficulties with the term, especially in the Brazilian context, but let's call them evangelical for the moment. They were able to tap into that kind of legacy, that sort of social inheritance that is proper of the culture, and sort of reframe it with an evangelical kind of code. But they're not new to the country. They're not new to the culture. In the case of kind of right now, right-wing populism in the country, this alliance took place fundamentally around moral issues connected to kind of family morality. One of the big platforms of Bolsonaro's election campaign was related to the idea that a family is father and a mother and an offspring. So there's a sense on this new form of evangelicalism that is emerging, that there is something kind of sacred to this idea of the family, and that left-wing politicians and movements are fundamentally a threat to this idea of the nuclear biological family. So I think that is a way in which kind of evangelicals have recoded something that was present in the culture in a kind of theological framework of their own. So that, I think it's part of Bolsonaro's kind of strength, and his base is right now, it continues to be strong because of that kind of moral narrative of national purity. of family purity or sexual purity. There is also a sense of patriotism that he is tapping into. One of his campaign slogan was "Brazil above everything, God above all," which I tend to think as a Brazilian sort of tropical version of, God bless America and nobody else.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like it's a kind of a tropical mimicry of that slogan, and that's his campaign slogan. He won on that platform. So there's that idea of a patriotism, of a nation that is now kind of lost and needs a strong kind of male leader to guide us back with a stern hand to bring us back into who we really are. There is a strong anti-communist rhetoric around Bolsonaro's presidency that is very, very important for evangelicals as well. Now, this is something that I need to think more deeply about. There's not been much written about it. Why is it that there's this kind of re-emergence, of this renaissance of kind of Cold War, almost MacArthurism in the tropics again? So I'm curious about that, but that's part of the language in dispute as well. This kind of hatred, this portrayal of communism as a huge threat, and so the right-wing populists are sort of presenting themselves as defenders of the country against the communist threat.
I feel like we could sort of just spend a whole another hour talking just about kind of the many parallels that I think you raised, because I think that the evangelical right in the United States made a very similar turn towards this sort of family values. I think of Jerry Falwell on focus on the family stuff. And, I think that is actually also closely related to sort of social construction of race and white supremacy and things like that. And I would love to spend some time talking with you about that. Maybe we can have you back in a few months or at some point to kind of talk about that conversation. But we are almost out of time. And since you are both a liberation theologian and a divinity school or professor, I did think I wanted to end with the question on what should liberation theologians be doing during these times and what should churches be doing. And we've only got about 2 minutes, so if you can
I'll be quick.
Try to be quick about that.
Okay, I'll try. So I would begin answering the church question, saying that the church is already on the move. So I would say I identify the protest movements, everything that is happening on the streets of Minneapolis and throughout the country and throughout the globe, as ecclesia. That's church in Greek. That an assembly. So people are assembling on the streets. They are mourning the death and the injustice of our time. They are ritualizing it. They are proclaiming things. So that's, for me, church. So I think the institutional churches should locate themselves at those movements and merge themselves with them, because that's where truth is being proclaimed. That's where death is being named and mourned, and I think that's where hope is being generated. So I think that's what liberation theology teaches us, that the church is the people and the church is on the move in the power of the Spirit. So these riots, these movements, these protests are, for me, assemblies of people who are being church together. So institutional churches should follow. Likewise, liberation theologians should be paying attention to that, should be reading the signs of the times, and understanding the ways in which liberation is gaining shape differently in our epoch. And then, proclaiming the truth of liberation in those contexts. So I don't think churches should do anything. I think churches are right there on the streets. And then those of us committed to institutional ecclesial bodies, we just should relocate our efforts and energies to where the Spirit is moving, which is out there on the streets, I think.
Well, thank you, Felipe, for that insightful reflection and what for me was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
You're very welcome, and I do hope we get a chance to have you back at some point. If you, our viewers, found this video to be helpful, please consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central Daylight Time, and features music and prayers in addition to a sermon. This week I'll be preaching an observation of Juneteenth, and we'll be debuting some new commissioned work from an African-American composer. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as it's safe for us to gather again. Please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we're all in this together.